Well, the screen's just rotated 90 degrees. You're on. So, and let me turn that music off.
I hadn't been there for 3 minutes. I was
Do it in that fashion. That was awesome.
Hey, honey, how are you? Hi, good to see you. Hi, girls. That's the neat one. Yes.
How are we going to do it? I'll do anything else.
Do you like the sunshine? And the bread and garlic butter.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. I think we might have one or two more that might trickle in, but my name is Patty Fabry and I work at Mountain Projects, and I just really want to thank you all for joining us. And while you're in the process of eating, if we can maybe just take a moment to offer thanks. So Lord, thank you for letting us come together tonight to learn and to share and to open our hearts to people who might be suffering and to remember the joy that you bring into our lives and to be able to celebrate that. Let us take this food in, let it build our bodies to be stronger, our hearts to be open, and our minds to be focused on you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, the magical. What we're talking about tonight, and let me ask, how many people have heard of the adverse childhood experiences? Okay, some. Just a quick summary of that. We call it ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it was a study that was done by Kaiser Permanente, an insurance company in California, and the CDC, Center for Disease. And part of what they did, it actually kind of ended up happening by accident. There was a physician named Dr. Folletti that was focused on helping people lose weight. He ran a weight loss clinic. And he found that as people lost weight, one of the things that would happen is the clients started disappearing. And so he started to meet with them and he asked them, what happened? And he realized that a lot of people started talking about when they lost weight, they started having memories from their childhood. And it was memories that were not pleasant memories of abuse and traumatic events. And so then he connected up with Dr. Robert Ananda at the CDC. And one of the things, they did this big study on middle and upper class folks that had health insurance. And they asked these questions about these different areas of abuse that people experienced in childhood. So they created this 10-point scale. And they found that depending on your score of how many checkmarks you have on that, there's an increased risk of health issues. A lot of which after a score of 4 or more, generally we could predict a certain amount of chronic disease in your life. And it began the search for the physiological effects of trauma, which has been a pretty new field in the last 20 years. So what we're going to be talking about is really some of the effects of trauma, particularly on early childhood development. And we're going to dabble our toes in building the resilience piece through the use of a trauma-informed lens. So kind of what that means is I'm going to ask you to think about the glasses you wear, and tonight we're just going to shift them a little bit so that we're looking at things just a little bit differently than we did before. Because as we are able to see and be more aware of trauma around us, we have a better chance of being able to help address it. So I do like to begin the program thinking about inviting you all to take a deep breath and wanting to honor that we are on Cherokee land. And wanting to honor that we are living within the Appalachian culture. we can create more of a common language of how to help support each other as we move ahead in our own healing and the healing of our communities. I do want to recognize that because we are talking about trauma, that some people might feel a little bit triggered, and your job is to take care of yourself today. Hopefully every day. So we're going for a shared understanding and into a shared language of an understanding of trauma and the way we can learn more about it and see it and communicate it to each other. Certainly being able to recognize what trauma looks like physically, emotionally, those kinds of things, and really spending a lot of time talking about the impact of trauma on the developing brain. So what we're going to start with is the underlying question. And I worked as a clinician for a long time. The language has changed a lot, thank goodness, where we've moved from that language of what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. Understanding that when we look at symptoms, as we say in the clinical world, that there are frequently adaptations to traumatic events in a person's life. So, it's important to recognize healing does happen, and how that happens is through a nurturing relationship and positive childhood experiences, because that's a whole new level of science that's coming out as well. It's important to recognize, too, that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. Sometimes it's just that touch on the shoulder, sometimes it's just sitting with the person quietly. It's just allowing space for that person to be seen. So you can be very therapeutic and not even be a therapist. Is this when you start? Or am I playing this video?
That's you.
Okay.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different from sympathy? Empathy fuels connection, sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space where someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I have it, yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
go back to some important key points about that, really, that ability to say, I'm sorry that's happened to you. That ability to stay out of judgment, and boy, I can be so good at it. Understanding empathy is really feeling with. It brings in that connection. Sympathy drives us apart, empathy brings us together.
So my name is Amber. I'm actually an elementary teacher here in Swain County. I grew up here. I'm going to be talking to you guys about trauma. So the first thing we have are the 3 E's of trauma. Our first E is the result of an event, or series of events, or even a set of events. Could be something small, it could be a natural one, it can be a created one, but it is all about an event. It's also about the experience that we have from this. Might be what we experience, what our family experiences. It could be physical, it could be an emotional experience, even a life-threatening one. And then it goes with the lasting effect of this. This affects you mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, and can actually affect your spiritual well-being. If you've ever lived through a horrible national event, I mean, we're in one right now, sometimes you sit there and you can wonder spiritually, why is this happening? Why did the Lord just have to do this? You have to kind of think about all these as trauma. Here we have a few different type of traumatic events. We have abuse, anywhere from emotional, sexual, physical, domestic violence, even witnessing violence. A lot of people don't think about that. But unfortunately, in the area that we're in the world that we're in, a lot of our children have seen this. And a lot of adults see this, but it really does affect children. Bullying and cyberbullying are a huge thing right now, especially cyberbullying with the world we live in, when technology is at your fingertips all the time. Chronic stressors, we're in a very high poverty rate here. Racism is a huge thing. Medical procedures, especially if you have stuff that goes on all the time. Community trauma, historical trauma, we're in an area where that happens. And even living with a family member with substance abuse. And then we have loss. These are things we can't really control. Things like death, being abandoned, neglect, separation, natural disasters. We're in a few of these at the time we're in right now too, unfortunately. But these are all sorts of events. Some of them we can control. A lot of them we can't. A lot of them our children have no control over whatsoever. And these are the kids who are going to be the most at risk. We do have experience. Our experience of trauma is affected by our how, our when, our where, and how often. So when people do experience trauma, their reaction can honestly be lessened by how those around them react. If you are in an experience where you're dealing with cyberbullying, and you have a very supportive family there, you're going to not have as many traumatic experiences from that versus somebody that's going through that individually by themselves. Here we have our effects of trauma. We do have that they can be a normal response to an abnormal situation. 99% of the time, you don't realize that you're going to go into a traumatic event. Nobody expects to wake up that day to have something terrible happen to them. Even the most pessimistic person in the world doesn't always expect that. But when you are in a traumatic event or a traumatic experience, how you react to it, it's going to be normal. Your fight, flight, or freeze, it's a natural thing. You have no control over that. So we don't necessarily see things the way that they might be. We're seeing the things as we are experiencing them. Our survival mode, it kicks in. And not everybody's going to react to that the exact same way. Our trauma, what we've been through as adults, what we went through as children, that's really going to affect how we are responding to various things. Our effects do create a pattern of behavior. One thing that really stuck out with me, and if you've ever watched any sort of crime show, the example they have, FBI human trafficking training describes how hard it is to get children out of the lifestyle of sex trafficking because this is their norm now. When you've lived this event over and over and over, it creates that cycle. It's the same sort of thing with any sort of substance abuse, with any sort of domestic violence. If you've grown up seeing that as a norm in your life, you're going to live that. And it's very hard to get yourself out of that. We have, here are effects and identifications of trauma. If you look at this list, it's a really long list. There is not one particular way that trauma actually stands out in any single person. And sometimes it's not even a visible thing. There are some physical, low energy, paleness, I mean, sometimes that's natural, lethargy, tons of different things that can come from physical, but most of these come with emotion, behavior, or even cognitive. So your trauma can affect your brain and how it's working and how you do respond to everything. And a lot of times, especially as an educator standpoint, these are the exact same things that can come out with some sort of a learning disorder diagnosis or with a behavior diagnosis, when unfortunately the child has just had a terrible, terrible home life and they're experiencing these horrific things. So we have to take as an educator and figure out what can we do to help this child, to help them manage this trauma. What can we do to help that child? Because they deserve that help from us.
All right, so Patty and Amber have talked a little bit about what we see, and we're not telling y'all anything new. You folks are in the community, you're in helping ministries and professions, and you deal with different people, and you see this stuff in lots of different ways. I'm Ted Duncan, I'm the associate pastor here, and part of my work is working with our middle school and high school students. So I get to deal with the adolescent brain sometimes and all the things that go on in that stage of life with kids. And so I get this opportunity to talk a little bit about, we talk about what we see, why do we see this? And the science that has come from this decade of research from adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs studies, and a lot of research behind that, it's conclusive. We can see how toxic stress and trauma can derail the brain development in a child. And we try to, as helpers, as professionals, to learn skills so that we can help people learn to do the emotional regulation that they might have missed out on as a child. And we begin to understand how trauma impacts our brain. So we're going to look at that just a little bit. And the science also shows this: while trauma really has this negative impact on the brain, it also shows us that it can be helped. And we're going to do a lot of describing the symptoms here, but we're going to get around to that part too, so I want to put that in there. So this whole idea of our brains have this bottom-up development. The cortex, the frontal lobe of our brain here, we call a very simplified way to talk about this is called that our upstairs brain, the prefrontal cortex. It's something that a lot of my middle schoolers and high schoolers have not developed yet. They're still working out of. The downstairs brain is the amygdala. So upstairs brain, cortex, calm. Downstairs brain is the amygdala, chaos. That's what those two parts of the brain are designed to deal with and to work with. So when the tiger or the bear runs into the room, your upstairs brain shuts down. And this is a good thing. You want those survival instincts, that fight or flight to kick in. That adrenaline rushes, the cortisol floods the brain, and all these things go on. So what they tell us is, though, and you've seen this sometimes, Tiffany's here with kids, we got y'all the parents, you're in helping positions and professions. In the chaos, don't join the chaos. Share your calm. So we had some law enforcement officers here at lunch today, and they're walking up on all these situations and seeing that they can't join the chaos, they have to bring the calm to the situation. So, looking at our brain development, at the birth, the brain is underdeveloped. Not all the building blocks are there. As we mature and as we go, it is a sequential thing, just like we learn to crawl before we learn to walk. And then we learn to walk before we learn to run. And the brain is built in the same way. And it's guided by our experiences as a child, how this process takes place in our brain. And as we experience things, the brain wires certain ways or modifies itself. We're very wonderfully made, but it responds to the experiences that it's had. So we got a couple of little videos here. These are all just about 2 minutes long gigs. We're just gonna watch one and then just make a real brief comment on it. And then we'll watch the next one, just make a few comments. Our time is super limited tonight. This is a 3-hour training that we're cut down into an hour, and we're gonna stop when it's time, but there's more here than we're gonna be able to do, but we'll do what we can tonight. So this is some of the science behind why we see what we see.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So, we live in a beautiful place. A lot of us like to hike on trails. I like to be outside, and I recently built a trail. I had a really steep piece of property, and I built what I call the zigzag trail. Worked my way up. To begin with, went through with the weed eater, just chopped down the brush, the first pass. Next pass I come through and raked it out of the way, and then I came through with the mattock and cut a little. Every time I passed through there, that path got easier and easier. And now you can just go walk that path and get up this really steep hill. It's kind of easy. Same way in our brain, the pathways that we use, the more we walk that same path, the easier it gets to walk. Maybe if you have a skill, you may remember the first time you tried to play the saxophone or you tried to ride a skateboard. The more you do it, those connections get made. So the same thing with our stressors. Our brains learn to deal with certain things, shut certain parts off, open certain parts up. So this next part is called serve and return. It just builds on what we just heard here. Any comments about the brain architecture, the pathways? Y'all see this sometimes? I mean, you know the things you can do well, the pathways you built. And if certain people have nurtured certain pathways or it's been built into them, that's what we see coming out. All right, let's look at serve and return.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When a baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage and serve in return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Okay, serve and return, like tennis. Somebody serves, somebody returns. It builds like that. They focused on the cognitive skills there, the academic picture. But you notice both these videos mentioned that as these pathways form, your emotional skills also are formed. Have you ever seen a child that's not able to regulate their emotions? Have you ever seen an adult that's not able to regulate their emotions? It's just not a skill they possess, or they're not very good at it. And we've all experienced that. This is two different PET scans, brain scans of young children. The one on the left is the brain of a normal child, and the colors you see, the red is the active areas in the brain, the purple are the inactive areas, and the green and yellow are in between. You notice the healthy brain, the normal brain on the left, what do you notice about it?
A lot of red.
A lot of red, a lot of stimulation, a lot of activity going on there. The one on the right, this is, you can't read this, but this was a Romanian orphan that was placed in an orphanage as an infant. And they did a great job there of meeting their physical needs. They would feed the babies, change their diapers, but then they put them in the crib. They didn't get the serve and return, they didn't get the attention, and you see what happens here, the difference in that brain. The red part near the top of the screen on the left one, that's that prefrontal part, activity. And you see on the right that a lot less activity there, parts where things are not even showing up. And this is just what's going on in that situation. So here, we're looking at what we call toxic stress that is constant, and how it derails this healthy brain development. And this is where I'm just going to say as a reminder, Patty said it one way already, that some of the content that you might see in these videos, it may be uncomfortable, it may trigger something new. We've all been different places, so if there's any time you just need to get up and get a breath of fresh air, or there's a water fountain out here, step aside, take care of yourself, do what you need to do here. We don't want to re-traumatize people, but so be careful of yourself here and care for yourself. But let's watch this little video on toxic stress and how it affects us.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So when you have a child that experiences this stress that's just ongoing and they don't have a caregiver around them to bring any kind of comfort, it develops that downstairs part of the brain. That part of the brain begins to work really good and work overtime, that survival. They go into survival mode. So without any kind of a nurturing caregiver, without an adult in their life that's caring for them, these young children, they're not able to move from operating out of their survival part of their brain into that upstairs cortex part of their brain, where those thinking and learning and reasoning behaviors are wired together. So this overdeveloped amygdala causes the brain to release unhealthy doses of cortisol, the adrenaline into the child's body. Our system is made to survive when the bear runs into the room to do what we need to do. When you have to live like that day after day after day, it's not designed to be healthy like that. So this is just a real simple way to help think about this. Now, if we did a neuroscience class, I'm sure it might be a little more advanced than this, but everybody put your hand up here. This is our brain. And put your thumb in next to it. Your thumb is your amygdala here. And this part here is your upstairs brain. These fingers, just wiggle your fingers a little bit. That's your upstairs brain. Here's your amygdala right here. And you can kind of tuck your amygdala here and wrap it around it. It's kind of tucked away down there. And then when trauma or stress comes in, though, they teach the kids, they call it popping their lid. They do this. That amygdala is in charge now. It's running the show here for a few minutes so that they can focus on survival. That's the part that needs to be working. So too much trauma, though, in their life will result in them living and reacting out of their downstairs brain, even when there's no actual danger still present, because that just becomes their norm, as Amber was talking about a while ago. So those emotional regulation skills, healthy coping skills, are the stairs that we can help put into people's lives. Just a simple coping skill, taking a deep breath, taking a walk, bringing that back down. The teachers probably do this with kids when they have to calm them down in a classroom, or if you step into a situation to de-escalate it somehow. And those are the kinds of skills that we won't get to as much tonight, but Becky Haas that provided this training to us. There are discipline-specific trainings that she provides. This is kind of an overview, but we can bring a training to our community here for our educators or for our law enforcement community or our healthcare community or whatever sector that helps us develop skills for that sector. And hopefully that'll be where we go as a community soon. We just wanted to get this basic information going. So 2 types of brains here. This slide kind of illustrates why we need to understand how trauma affects a brain. You might have 2 children in the same class or in your youth program or your guardian ad litem program, and they might have developed in 2 very different ways. And these 2 kids, they won't have the same capacity to learn and to be resilient and to grow. It'll just be different because this is where they are. You can see that in a normal situation, we don't think much about survival. We're safe, we're taken care of. We use most of our energy and time in our brain for our cognition, our social, emotional stuff. But when you're over here experiencing toxic stress, your brain is overtime on survival. And the resources aren't there for the other social, emotional, and cognition that can take place. So that's some of what's going on there. prolonged exposure to the toxic stress with no caregiver in the child's life impacts their success socially, academically, all these ways. So, you know, it's good for parents to know, just for all of us that are parents, to know the importance of understanding how this works and help them out there. So Jessica's gonna come.
Hi, oh, I'm very short.
It'll pick you up.
Okay. I also don't feel comfortable on a microphone. I'm Jessica, I know most people who are here. I'm actually a teacher at the middle school, and when they sent out a thing about, you know, if there were any teachers who wanted to come to this trauma meeting, informed care, I was like, oh, I want to go to that, because I feel like, as I've taught for 20 years, and I feel like the biggest thing that I build with students is relationships. And whenever I have a student teacher or I'm a mentor for somebody, I feel like that's what I try to really emphasize, because if you have those relationships with students, a lot of this stuff, you do see where it's coming from. I see a lot of new teachers who get frustrated really quickly with behaviors and don't always know to look at the underlying what's causing it. So I think it's really necessary to understand where kids come from and why they sometimes act out in the way they do. So you have paper on your table. I'm a, let's work together kind of person. So these are not going to be shared. You're not going to share these with even your table mates. But I want you to write down 3 things right now that you are stressed about. 3 things.
Just 3?
Just 10 for you, 10. Just 3 or 4 things that you are stressed about right now. And we're, like I said, we're not going to share them because that makes people uncomfortable, and I only do that to my students. So. Take it out pretty quick. That a girl. Mom, 3 things that stress you out. Have them in your head. We're involving everyone in the meeting. All right, so if you have them, great. If you're still writing, I'll give you another little bit of time.
Wait, teachers.
I know. All right, so as I go through these 3 things, the reason I had you write them down, one, I think it helps to make it applicable to you as to what I'm talking about. So I want you to just think about where your things fall in these 3 types of stress that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is a positive stress. This is things like you're new to a school, or you're going to a church for the first time, or maybe you're starting a new job. And so these are things that can stress people out, but they're really a positive stress. It's important to learn how to meet new people, how to put yourself out there, those kind of things. Tolerable stress is stress like a death. Doesn't mean it's a good stress, but it means it's a stress that if you have support, you're going to get through. Doesn't mean you're going to get over, just means you're going to get through. Okay, it could be something like a disaster. Terrible situation, but with support, you're going to get through. And then the last one is toxic stress, and this is things like ongoing repeated exposure to abuse or neglect. And if you don't have supportive adults or people around you, can lead to addiction, can lead to mental health problems, physical problems, which these guys talked about earlier. So just kind of glance at your list and be thinking about, where did mine fall, And it can maybe help you think about how that might be affecting your life, physically or mentally, or things like that. So just be thinking about, where do my stressors fall, and how do I get through them? I hope that for most of you, you're looking at the green and the yellow. Some of you may have some red, and we have a lot of students. And I can speak to students mostly. I have 2 children of my own, but I see a lot of students deal with a lot of toxic stress. But what I find is the difference between the red and the yellow is those supportive adults in their life, if they have them. Okay. So this kind of just shows you a visual of how people respond. So if you have a positive stress, there might be a stress there, but then you're going to come down from that pretty quickly. You should see middle school students the first day. They're terrified to be there if they're a new student. By the end of the day, they have a best friend and a friend group for the most part. Tolerable stress, it's going to affect you a little bit longer, but you can kind of see you come down from it at a gradual rate. If you look at the toxic response, you go up, you're stressed, and you stay there. Okay, and we have a lot of kids living, and adults living in that space. So some factors that can increase the impact. The early occurrence. I have stressed over and over, and I'm so glad our county finally has parents as teachers back. I feel like that was a program that when we lost funding for that was horrible. I'm so glad that we have that program back, because those of you who don't know, Parents as Teachers is a program that goes into the homes of kids birth to kindergarten, and it is vital. 90% of the brain is developed by the age of 5. And if we're not getting these kids till kindergarten, we're losing a lot of those brain synapses that happen. And they only happen, it's kind of like trying to learn a language as an adult versus learning a language, second language as a child. That can kind of tell you how those brain synapses work. Blaming or shaming. We have kids who feel like it's their fault. Things that happen to them definitely feel like it's their fault. Patty said at the very beginning, that whole not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Being silenced or not believed, that's a big one. I have a student who, this was years ago, told of abuse that was happening. The mom knew it was happening, and nothing was ever done. And almost the mom's betrayal was harder for that student than the actual abuse, she would say. And then the perpetrator is a trusted caregiver. It's way more likely that kids are going to be abused or neglected by somebody that they know versus a stranger. So, but all of those increase the impact. You know, that kind of just is common sense. The younger it happens to you, a lot of times the more it's going to affect you. All right, so Ted talked about the amygdala earlier, and Amber touched on it also, this whole fight, flight, or freeze. So if you see students, and I keep saying students, children, because I know some of you do guardian ad litem and different things like that. If you see children, the part of the brain, the amygdala, is that part that Ted said that deals with that being scared, or there's some sort of fearful or threatening stimuli that's happening. And so children, are going to do one of 3 things usually. They're going to fight. So these are children you see who are angry. They're combative. They're constantly, I've had students call me names and then be hugging my neck 5 minutes later. That's, you know, they have that such anger, non-compliance. Flight, they're going to be withdrawn, uncooperative, and then if they freeze, they're just kind of unmotivated. These are the kids that you might look at and be like, well, they just don't care. And I hear teachers say that, and that makes me sad. Because I don't think it's that they don't care. I think that they just tried to care for so long and it hasn't really mattered. So recognizing that these behaviors are how they're surviving. Having compassion, it doesn't necessarily mean that you let every behavior go. You don't. To me, that is having compassion when we teach those behaviors or things that should kind of be happening. I had a student one time who used to be super talkative, friendly, fun, made good grades. After Christmas break, came back, was extremely withdrawn. Didn't talk to any of her friends anymore, which is kind of common in middle school, so you don't chalk it up to just that, but she stopped doing her schoolwork, she stopped doing her homework. And I think it would be really easy for me to have just said, oh, she's a teenager, it's hormones, and there's a piece of that, that's true. But there was more to it than that. She had had a traumatic event over Christmas, and seeing those warning signs and being compassionate, I think goes a long way. All right, so behavior is like an iceberg. So what we see, whether it's in the classroom or if you're a big brother, big sister, or whatever, what you see is the outward behavior. So you see the 6-year-old who's throwing blocks, or they don't have blocks in first grade anymore, let's say pre-K. Not that I'm angry about that. It's a whole other, we'll have that talk later. What you see is that outward behavior, whether it's the withdrawn or the angry or the whatever. You have to know that there are feelings and emotions under the surface. You have to figure out something is going on for this child that's causing this misbehavior. I have never had a student misbehave that something wasn't going on for them. And when I say misbehave, I'm not talking about a student who decided to throw a paper airplane across the room, but I have never had a student who has had severe behavior issues, that there was not something going on for them. And it's important as adults that we are cognizant of that and paying attention. So, what does trauma look like? You may have kids who are avoidant. You know, you see the kid on the slide that's by themselves, that's what you're supposed to be focused on in that picture. Stays away from other kids. Maybe they're disconnected. A lot of times people think of this as, well, they have ADHD, which I'm going to talk about in a second. They're not paying attention. They never look at the board. They can't write things down because, they're 5, but whatever. They're angry. Maybe they act out. They throw things in class or they don't listen. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced this. And then hypervigilant is where they start to focus on everything. They have to, they're constantly, they're sensitive to their surroundings, and everything seems to, bother them in a way. So, which of these, and you don't have to answer, but think about it. If you were having some sort of trauma or something, I think all of us fall somewhere in one of these 4 sometimes. I fall in the angry one, I can tell you. It's a pretty natural thing for me to get angry pretty quickly. I'm working on it, but but I think all of us do one of these in some way. All right, this one they said during lunch was really hard to see, so I'm going to do a little more reading than I normally would off of a slide. It's a Venn diagram for any of you who are not English people. This is comparing, they've done a lot of research into trauma and ADHD. I taught pre-K for a while, then I taught elementary school for a while, and now I teach middle school, so I feel like I've done a gamut of age groups. I think, personally, it's a personal opinion, not whatever it's called by this organization, I think it's overdiagnosed. I think ADHD is overdiagnosed. Is it real? Sure, it is. But I think it's overdiagnosed because I think a lot of times the behaviors that we see that mimic ADHD come from trauma, and I'll just put in a lack of outside and exercise. Okay? So if you look up here, the ones on the left, trauma is like irritability, quick to anger, feelings of guilt or shame, continually feeling on alert for threat or danger. And then ADHD is like difficulty sustaining attention, struggling to follow instructions, difficulty with organization. But what overlaps in the middle is what I'm going to focus on, and that is difficulty concentrating and learning in school. We have a lot of kids who are hungry. If they're hungry when they come to school, they're not going to be able to focus. Easily distracted? Well, of course they are. They're having trauma. They're going to distract themselves any way they can from the students who they're with who may or may not be experiencing trauma. Often don't seem to listen, disorganized, hyperactive, restless, difficulty sleeping. So again, not that I'm saying ADHD is not a thing, it definitely is. But I think a lot of times, and they agree, that it's misdiagnosed as ADHD when it's truly trauma that they're experiencing. So, any questions about that one? I know it's hard to see. Okay, who's next?
Can I just add one point to that?
Please.
Is that part of the difficulty is in a clinical setting, historically, we've not asked about the trauma. We just looked at the behavioral responses and haven't gone back to say what's happened. To make that connection of, oh, this makes sense now, why you're responding this way.
And from the educator standpoint, when we are asked by parents to fill out paperwork for ADHD, because we have to provide paperwork from our side, it only has to do with the stuff that's in the yellow. And it's never anything of the traumatic, it's can they stand in line? Can they follow directions? Can they sit in their chair? Not why would this child not be able to do that?
Are you talking about the neighborhood ones?
Yes.
I actually have them for my own now.
Well, the
And
other,
it does mention some of the trauma now.
Now it has gotten a lot better.
well,
Yeah.
one of the things as a teacher that's hard sometimes too is we're not allowed to mention ADHD or trauma. Like, I can't call a parent, I can call a parent and say I'm concerned. I can call a parent and say, and that there again goes back to the relationship piece of building that relationship, so you can call the parents and say those things, some of those things, but I can't call a parent and say, I think your kid has ADHD, that is a legal no. So it is tough to figure out, like,
So how do you describe the child's behavior?
If
That's
it's-
what you have to do, you have to describe the behavior.
you do, you can describe behavior to a parent, but I cannot say, I think your kid has autism, I think your kid has ADHD, even though we can tell usually, not always, but we could describe behavior. If a parent comes to us and says, I think my child has whatever, or I would like my child tested, we can do that if it comes from the parent, but that's a good point. We can point out behaviors. Your child is struggling with focus. Your child is hitting other children every day, whatever it is, we can tell them those things, but we have to be very cautious about labeling anything.
And I have provided letters to the doctors as well. When I
Yeah.
filled out the forms and sent them, I started out strictly virtual. So I can second and third grade across our entire county. And there was a parent who was concerned that her child was ADHD. And I agreed to fill out the paperwork, having only been with her for about a month and a half. But with COVID, you have to take those appointments and you can't. There's only really one hospital, one area, something in our whole community. And within that, I told them, I said, I'm not comfortable filling out this entire form, but I would like to provide a teacher notes if I can. So I wrote a letter about everything that I had seen and included that in with the paperwork. And that was helpful and beneficial for the doctor and the family.
It's comical too, they ask you things that teachers would never know, like, does your child, you've seen it, does the child eat dinner? I don't know. I mean, I could ask the child, but they could lie. Does the child get enough sleep at night? Well, not there, no, you think I'm there 24 hours, but I'm not, so, it's interesting. So, sorry, Ted.
No, you're good. So we touched some on what we see, we've touched some on why we see it, and we can't spend more time there. I would highly recommend just a really quick TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Ash that talks about the ACEs studies. She was involved with that, and adverse childhood experience studies, just Google that. There's tons of research there now. A documentary movie called Resilience. We can get, if you've not seen that, it documents all that study and where that science came from. We can get that access to resilience. You can't just find it anywhere online. You have to have
We have that. So
Yeah,
if you
we-
ever want to show it.
Patty's got it, and we've shown it here through the church, through the schools before, so we can. There's things out there, so keep digging on that. The good news is, all this, and this is the part that we wanted to get to, and spend the rest of our time on, is building resilience and positive childhood experiences and protective factors. What can we do about this? And some of those pieces. So just real quickly, when we think about resilience, what is resilience? Y'all give me a definition of resilience.
Ability to bounce back.
The ability to bounce back, yes. The ability to recover quickly from something, that you experience something and you're back the next day. So for fostering resilience, just real quickly, you can kind of see the little, when in a child's life, the positive outweighs the negative, and it has to do with where that fulcrum is. And we can see here, notice we get some more negative outcomes. When it starts to tip that way, well, maybe the fulcrum, their worldview, the way they've experienced things and seen things is in a little different place. But if we shift that fulcrum and give them the skills, then we can start to see more positive outcomes. So those are some of the things here. We've got a few videos here. Do we want to show Chad and Unique and Josh, or how do we want to do it time-wise? They're about 6 minutes each.
Yeah, I think one or two is fine.
We'll do
Chance is really good.
Chads and presenters. Who's your vote tonight.
I really like Chad's.
We're gonna do Chad's, so then we'll do Josh's or Unique's, so. But we'll watch both of these in sequence, and then we'll come back and talk to them for time's sake. Here again, what's the best way for me to phrase this? Take care of yourself if you need to, step out, because these are trauma survivors telling their story of some of the things they've experienced. And as we watch this, though, watch them, both of these young men, and maybe even if we watch Unique's, they have a support system, and help identify what support systems they did have that helped them navigate some of the trauma and stressors that are illustrated here. And while both of these stories end somewhat positively, you know, some of the story along the way is pretty tough to watch. So it gets at me every time I watch it. I've seen it a lot of times now. But so, like I said, feel free to step out or take care of yourself if you need to. So we'll watch a couple of these just back to back. We'll start here with Chad's story.
It's just hard with that. I mean, I was just a kid. I mean, because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening to us, and the brutal. Oh my God, there's a school. If you go right up here, there's a turn, and you can situate and something back here. Yeah. And there were some good times though, like, we had a good 30 minutes or so before we heard the sliding glass door open, and one day he came in and he actually had pizza, like supreme pizza, and another day, everything was fine, and another day he came in, for no reason, he just smashed my mom's head against that cabinet there. Just thinking of, just to the left of where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so. There's one time where we're sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, you know, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something. Because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do.
Coach Mark was a person I really trusted at this time. He was always there.
Yeah, there was times I would give him a ride. We talked, sometimes we wouldn't talk. But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. Even my family wasn't there. I just went and looked it up. And this big old just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. If you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know. You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
It's the last time you saw him. About 8 years ago. Actually, right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took you there, like after high school graduation. But take this ride. It's gonna be your first ride right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up. I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew y'all were doing something.
I heard you were in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Let's see. I'm so proud of you. Done well. Done well.
Well, it's tough. Nobody's safe here. Cops don't even like to come here. It's not a nice place.
Is there a lot of fighting?
Yes, daily. Could be somebody, they want your lunch. They think you're weak. They're trying to show dominance. Teachers are scared to death.
Do you remember one of the students named Unique?
Yeah, shy, very withdrawn. I think everything she witnessed at the school broke her spirit. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, you try to save them, but what do? You know, they do so much.
In middle school, you shouldn't have to go through that. Especially as a kid. Fights going on, people bringing knives. One of my friends got stabbed. I was just scared. I just felt like I'm invisible. Maybe I should just give up. Or just seeing too much. I couldn't take it anymore. As a kid, you're gonna snap. And that's what happened. I snapped. I went to the restroom and I saw like a nasty message. And it was like, to me. I was on the verge of literally losing it. I was screaming, I was kicking, I was just punching the walls. I kicked at the door, and I just ran out. And I saw Officer Al. At that moment, he saw me. He definitely comforted me. He was listening to the frustration and the anger and the sadness that I had. Tears in his eyes. I felt that I was seen. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was supposed to be here.
What about stairs?
It's hard to talk about Stanios without getting choked up. She saved my life.
You can only do so much. You can only do so much, and sometimes I literally feel defeated. Fortunately, I have some students who I know I'm capable of. Sorry. just to see progress lets me know that I'm moving on the right path. Because I know that if I touch just one, not just as a drama teacher, but as a teacher in general, if you can get to that pain, because a lot of these children, my goodness, they just have something to say. They're not being listened to. They're crying out. They're acting out as their way of saying, I am in the room. I am here. And so I don't just arm them with the script. I arm them with paper and a pen. You tell your own story. Unique had all the makings of a warrior, a leader. As we collaborated, she grew more confident. She got her voice back, and she was just fearless. She's one of the students who taught me how deep I could love. I don't know where she is, but I would love to see her. It's been so long. It's been at least 10 years. And so what's your name? I'm talking to you. Who are you? I can't hear you. Who are you? Miss Daniels? Who are you? I'm unique. Oh no! To the back of that wall. I'm unique. Why are you here? Unique. Because I broke barriers. You did what? I broke barriers. There's someone in the back of that room not paying any attention to you. Right there. I broke barriers. Tell them, who are you? I am unique. Why are you here? Because I am unique and I belong here. Oh my gosh. Oh, you could do it. I'm so proud of you.
Well, that was a happy movie.
I just want to invite everybody to take a deep breath.
Powerful stories, powerful things that these individuals lived through. Thinking about what we've been talking about, the stresses and adults in their lives. Thinking back to Chad. What kind of stress was Chad experiencing? This domestic violence at home, and was it the positive stress, the tolerable stress, or the toxic stress? Yeah, he's on high alert all the time. Never knew when he's had this parent with a major anger issue that they just lived with. So that was what was going on in Chad's story. I don't know about Unique. I haven't. That's the first time we watched this one as a group. What kind of stress was she experiencing? So, seeing what's going on there, what were their positive influences? What positive influences did Chad have, or Unique? They had someone to talk to. Who was it?
Well, the football coach was one.
For Chad,
Whether
yes.
or not they opened up fully on the situation, but they still had someone to look up to, you know, make them feel like they had someone who cared.
Yeah, Chad had his football coach, just gave him a ride home. It's not rocket science. It hurt him a little bit. Took him to make some barbecue. You know. What do you need to say about Miss Daniels? Did you hear that? She probably saved my life. Who else? Well, so Chad, there was the coach. Who else did you see in Chad's story?
Was that the counselor in the beginning?
Yeah, this school nurse or counselor, whoever it was that he went to had stomach issues. You know, somebody.
That might have been his teacher.
Yeah, it might have been a teacher, but that lady said told the coach, "Hey, coach, watch out for this kid." You know, so that they were there. In Unique, Miss Daniels. Who else was in Unique story?
That's not wrong.
Yeah, the school resource officer called her that day. She was flipping her lid and just was just there with her. You know, they saw her. So just all these testimonies to what a positive influence in a child's life, and the ACEs studies show us that just having one or two caring adults in your life makes all the difference. It puts more eggs in that positive outcome basket. You know, I think about our big brothers, big sisters. They do simple things. They just meet up with the kid and spend some time with them, listen to them. We can do that in our churches, in our schools, in our communities. So we're going to skip past Josh's there. Increasing positive childhood experiences. Have we said all we want to say about the case studies before we move on? Increasing these positive childhood experiences. Adults who reported high numbers of positive childhood experiences versus those that had no positive or low positive experiences. 72% lower levels of depression, adult depression, and poor mental health in those that had the positive. 3.5 times more likely to get the social and emotional support they needed as an adult. So if you know, we all face stressors, but if you have the ability to go seek out a counselor, or you just have those positive things because you've had positive input there. You see some of the statistics there. So from all the studies that we've done, have been done, adverse childhood experiences, they may be fact, which we are well established, but they're not the fate. They can be changed. Kids who experience positive experiences and have adults around them that support them, they can improve their mental health, improve their situation there. And the good news is that it's dose responsive. The more positive, the more it moves that fulcrum to a positive place. So even if they've had adverse experiences, it can be changed. That's not always an easy thing, as we can all attest to, but it can be. As we understand more about it, we can learn the skills to help move that more effectively than what we might have learned as in our experience growing up. So, and Amber's going to lead us into some more of this about the positive side of things here. Go, Amber.
So I'm going to really try to make it through this without crying myself. This one really does give a good definition, a good explanation of 7 really positive childhood experiences going from anything of having somebody in your family to talk to, all the way down to feeling safe and having people that care about you, feeling supported, feeling like you belong. This is the one I really kind of want to focus on. Patty mentioned earlier, there are 10 ACEs, and they range everywhere from experiencing or witnessing domestic violence, drug substance abuse, things like that. By the age of 6, I've experienced all 10. My mother, actually I'll start with my father. My father by the time I was 5 had been put in jail. My mother, my older sister and I went to live with her. She was a drug user, would take my sister and I with her when she would go to do things to get money for drugs. And the only way my sister and I had food is if we stole it. And we grew up thinking, this was us. We. And it's really hard as an adult now to look back and think, what did we do? Why were they not better? But those 7 experiences really do affect you now. At 6, my grandmother got custody of my sister and I. We lived with my grandmother, we lived with aunts, uncles, cousins. We grew up with anybody that we could possibly have after we were no longer with my mother and father. And the experiences that they gave us helped shape me into who I am now. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from a 4-year university. Of my grandmother's children and my 12 cousins and sisters, my older 2 sisters now are both ER nurses, and my younger sister is actually going on to work becoming an educator as well. This is not an easy task for any of us. Growing up, and I can say this because I was friends with Mellie's daughter growing up, we did everything we could to try to experience friends, try to experience normal. And thankfully, our friends' families treated us just like we were their own. That really does help with that positive childhood experience. That helps change that mindset that we're going to have. And a lot of us that work with children who do have high ACE scores, anything over, 6? 4, anything over 4, the higher it gets, the more challenging that child's life is going to be. So anything we can do as the adult, anything you can do as a positive role model in their life is a huge thing. Even if it's just sitting there and listening to them, well, they just want to talk to you about their day. They might not want to tell you everything that happened, but maybe they want to show you something they're super proud of, and you just made their entire week by listening to that child's story. If we think about our protective factors and we focus on being protected, we focus on promoting positive self-talk, positive image, positive change, then we really are reducing these risk factors. I very easily could have known a statistic. Based off of the science and based off of the numbers, I should have been a drug user. I've never in my entire life. My sisters have not. We easily could have followed in the exact same footsteps our parents gave us. We have family protective factors. With these, you are looking at parenting skills, social connections, so you're taking time for your children, especially when they're in time of need. You're fostering positive attention, you are fostering developmental, social, and emotional skills, letting them try to work through some of this stuff on their own, not crazy trauma, but whenever they have a problem with a friend, let them try to work through some of this stuff, offer them listening ear, and give them some advice, but let them try it without you having to do it for them. We have our community, so this is what we can do as a total, as a whole, trying to keep our neighborhoods safe. Thankfully, our area is not super high crime rate, so we're pretty lucky with that. Our schools, we do everything we can to foster a safe and nurturing school environment. Providing safe and stable housing, I know that can be a challenge whenever you do have children who are experiencing trauma. Access to nutritious food. We have gotten very lucky with the area we're in now. K-5 is completely free breakfast and lunch across both schools. And we are very blessed that that's happened. We've actually had that in the last, I think, 4 years.
All schools are this year.
Yeah, all schools are now, thankfully, but elementary, I know I can speak to that because I'm there. We have been very, very lucky about that. Access to employment. I know right now we're in the high unemployment rate, but there's jobs everywhere. But within this, not really making people feel terrible if they do have to get a menial job. Of, you know what, I'm very proud of you. You stepped out of that comfort zone, you are doing something amazing. Access to medical care, including behavioral health and mental illness. That is a huge stigma that we have in our area as a whole, is that if you have some sort of mental issues, if you have some behavioral issues, that's a huge stigma. People don't like to talk about that, but it does happen all the time, especially with behavioral stuff. Having safe transportation. We are really lucky that we do have this way transit. They are very, very helpful with that. access to affordable childcare, and even just kind of including everybody to show that no matter what you are, what you look like, you are included and you are just as equal. And then we have our charging stations. This is a pretty important one because if we think about our brains and our bodies and our emotions, we have to recharge. You can't go nonstop without eventually just shutting yourself completely down. The more stress you have, the more our battery is going to drain. The more you're really going to become overwhelmed. You're going to feel all these issues. So it's important to make sure you are recharging yourself and that your children are getting the opportunity to recharge themselves as well. And this can change over time. What you need today isn't necessarily what you're going to need a month from now, 6 years from now. So understanding that that does change and that anybody can be supported. The person that took care of me was my grandma. Without her, I would be lost. You don't have to be a parent. You don't have to be a grandparent. You don't have to be a teacher, a coach, anybody. You can be somebody that's just there for your supportive person. You can be the social worker. You can be the pastor. Anything that you can do to help these people because you know them. You see them. You can hide it as best as you try, but you see something. You see that kid sitting by themselves. You see that adult sitting by themselves. It's 2 seconds to walk over and say, hey, you okay today? It's not that hard to really just check in on people. Okay. You guys are. You're welcome.
So I just want to go back and highlight that, based on what you just shared about, we talked about 2 types of trauma. One that's natural, all the floods and that. But the other is based, the creative one is based on secrecy and shame. And we know that this is happening in all of our communities. And anything we can do to continue these discussions and to break that silence, because as long as I'm silent, as long as this community is not responding, I'm going to experience that shame and believe that it's me. But when you start talking about it, it makes a crack inside that, as we say, with the little thing right here, the healing begins. When I can see something different in you, it allows me to see something different in me. And it's part of this positive childhood experience. I don't think Chad calmed down and settled down overnight. Over his lifetime, he's become a different person. So it's that thing, sticking with people and adding those positives. Thinking about all the supports we have in the community, Big Brothers, Big Sister, Family Resource Center, and parents as teachers. How do we bring those together and add a little to it? Just add a little to it. Whatever I can do, what can I add to it? We're thinking about the awareness needed about the impact of childhood trauma. And I shared this with the group earlier today. With a male with an ACE score of 6 is 46 times more likely to be an IV drug user. And here we are in the middle of an opiate epidemic. And I don't know what you all hear about those people that are using those things, but I can tell you what I hear is not pleasant. 46 more times. Now, if we want to talk about, you see the American Heart Association, people who don't exercise, you're 1.4 more times likely to have a heart attack. Or if you smoke, you're 1.6 to 2.1 times more likely to have a heart attack. But with an ACE score of 6, I'm 46 times more likely. But why aren't we talking about that? Last point. Really want to talk about the fact that I might have an ACE score of 6 or even an ACE score of 9 or 10. It's not my fate. I don't have to. With a high ACE score of 9 or 10, there's a really good chance that your life will be shortened by 20 years. Because physiologically, the impact of that trauma shortens your lifespan. But if I have those supportive people in my life, they can turn that around. So thinking about trauma and mental health, certainly the earlier those events happen in childhood, this is what you're going to see, the more complicated cases that you're all seeing in the community. The earlier it happens, the more frequent you see things. The earlier first admissions, more frequent and longer hospital stays, more time in seclusion and straight. It just, the younger they are, the more complicated, more heavy dosing of mental health services they get. Trauma and substance abuse. 65% of all substance abuse clients report experiencing childhood trauma. I can tell you that most of the clients I've worked with in my clinical days, it was closer to 95%. 75% of women in substance abuse treatment report a history of trauma. 92% of homeless mothers have severe trauma histories. ACEs are a huge contributing factor to homelessness. So trauma in children. This is the part that's a little difficult for me to try to fathom. 60% of American children are exposed to violence, crime, or abuse in their homes, schools, or communities. 40% of children are direct victims of 2 or more violent acts. 1 in 10 children are victims of violence 5 or more times before they're 18 years old. Suicide is the second leading cause of death, 10 to 17-year-olds. 3.5 to 10 million children witnessing violence against their mothers at home. So we're up against the mountain, but you know we're mountain people. Juvenile justice, if any of you are involved with the juvenile justice system, the statewide director, Billy something Callister, I'm sorry, my brain just went. He reported 100% of the youth in the North Carolina juvenile court system are victims of abuse. 100%. So why we started talking about children is because the earlier we begin to catch it, the better the prognosis. As we look at preventative efforts to build those supports for children, it also means building supports for families, because healthy families will raise healthy kids. Then it means building a healthy community, because healthy communities create healthy families, which create healthy kids. So there actually is a trickle-down effect for this. So the more we work to reduce, to intervene on children, the better the prognosis. So there's a lot of resources that you probably can't see on that. But there is a lot of work going on in North Carolina to address trauma and resilience and look at those protective factors. When Becky was teaching us, and probably 2 minutes over, she shared stories about all these things that people did in the alternative school. Their staff got trained and they agreed to practice the tools for a year, and the graduation rate went from like 8 students to 65. I mean, the attendance, just people showing up for people, it makes a huge difference. Family that created the Isaiah House, which I shared earlier with the Guardian and Lions, that when they're waiting to be picked up by a foster parent, they were sitting in somebody's office for, could be 8 or 10 hours. They opened a house that was kid-friendly, full of toys. And that became a place where they took the kids while they waited for a foster parent. So it's little things that all of us can chip in and can create a huge difference. So we have a mountain, and it's time for us to equip ourselves with some tools and start climbing. And part of that was y'all being here tonight. So I really want to thank you. I want to ask, are there any questions or comments?
I would like to get names again. I saw in the beginning. What are your names again?
At the end, there's our emails too. If you keep going.
There you go.
I think that should be in your slides.
No, only one.
Yeah.
Janet
Oh, okay. Ted Duncan at Gmail, Ted C. Duncan at gmail.com. I'll share with you the last slide, to make a difference in someone's life, you don't have to be brilliant, rich, beautiful, or perfect. You just have to care. So thank you all.